Good afternoon. My name is John Geha. I am the CEO of Columbus REALTORS. We're very excited this afternoon to present a conversation with Dr. Eddie Glaude. And I would like, with great pleasure, to introduce our 2021 president of Columbus REALTORS, Michael Jones. Michael, I'm going to turn this over to you.
Thank you very much, John, and good afternoon to everyone who's able to join us live during this event. I am Michael Jones, the president of Columbus REALTORS, and Dr. Glaude, I won't get to introduce you formally, but certainly want to thank you and tell you what a privilege it is to have you sharing with our members and our entire community this afternoon. John, I'd like to applaud you and our entire staff. Both your creating an inclusive culture within our association and throughout our community is very important. Finding ways to solve and deal with racism that is very prevalent in society today, as well as various inequities and biases that continue to exist. It's a key priority in our organization and part of our strategic plan. So thank you for supporting that, upholding that, and putting that into life at Columbus REALTORS. Today is part 2 of a 3-part series that we have for our Columbus REALTORS Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Book Club. Today's conversation is co-hosted by Columbus REALTORS Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Book Club, Columbus Realtist Association, and Realty, Coldwell Banker Realty. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce my friend and colleague, Buzz Thomas, who is also a member of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee and Book Club. And Buzz will introduce Dr. Glaude and get everything started. Buzz? It's all yours.
Thank you. It is not only a pleasure, but also a privilege to be able to be a part of this. As Michael said, my name is Buzz Thomas. Dr. Glaude, for those of you who have not seen or don't know him, is, I've seen him at least, I don't know, 18 times on television, and one of the most interesting and articulate men. He is chair of the African American department at Princeton University. He's the author of a number of books. The particular one that we're going to focus on today is Begin Again. We had the opportunity on Tuesday to actually talk to him, and his preference is actually to have a conversation. So what I'm going to do is to ask some questions, sort of seed the field, if you will. If you have questions that you'd like to direct to him, if you go to the chat box, members of the staff will collect those questions and then they'll be forwarded on. Dr. Glaude, I guess an obvious question is, why another book about James Baldwin? And not only why another book, but why now? What was the aha moment that you had when you said, I have to write this book? And why is he relevant today?
Well, first of all, let me thank John and Michael and you and everyone out there who have made this moment possible. Len, for all the work you're doing and you did in the background. For all the folks who are making sure that this webinar, this Zoom actually works. It's, you know, whenever I'm near a Zoom, there's always a danger that it might crash. So this is a wonderful thing. But John, I want to thank you for your vision and for your commitment to the value of diversity, equity, and inclusion, to understanding what a genuinely racially just society would look like, and what we need to do to commit ourselves to being on that path. And Michael, thank you for your historic leadership. We want to lift you up in this moment as well. So to answer your question, Buzz, I remember saying to myself, they've done it again. They've done it again. After the election in 2016. So I was really grappling with my own despair and disillusion, because I didn't think the nation would elect someone so obviously unqualified to be the president of the United States. Now, that's my political position. It's clearly known. Some may disagree with me. But I was despairing and disillusioned. I was worried about my son, that he would have to endure this world again, that he would have to carry on and try to dream dreams in a world that denied him dignity and standing. So I had to deal with my own despair and disillusionment. And then there's the other part. I was worried about those babies in Ferguson and in Baltimore, all of those Black Lives Matter activists who put their lives on the line for a better America. And I was worried about what they would do, how they would respond to the country's decision to elect the previous president. And some of them were dying, in Ferguson in particular, right? Some of them were committing suicide, at least so they say. And so I knew Baldwin had his moment of despair and disillusionment. He says that as a writer, you can never despair. If you despair, then you're done as a writer. Baldwin was exaggerating in that moment, because after the assassination of Dr. King in 1968, Baldwin tried to commit suicide in 1969. And so he had to figure out how to pick up the pieces. What does it mean? What did it mean that the country had killed King? Right? Not some lone figure, but the country had set the stage for the assassination of this apostle of love. And so I knew, after teaching Baldwin for 30 something years, I suppose, not 30, 20 something years, reading him for 30, that, how can I put this? I knew that he had to grapple with his own sense of despair, that he had to find the resources to pick up the pieces. And so he had written 7,000 plus pages of work, and I had been teaching him for all of these years. So I said, well, let me just dive into the rubble and the ruin to find some resources to help me in my moment of despair and disillusionment. And what I found there was Begin Again. So that's what drove me there, because I think Baldwin is the most insightful critic we've ever produced, the most insightful writer we've ever produced around the issue of race and democracy. He grabs Ralph Waldo Emerson by the collar and snatches him across the proverbial railroad tracks, right? Such that an Emersonian preoccupation takes on a different kind of valence in his hands. So the world we're just catching up to him, I think. That's what it is. Yeah, so that's to answer the question. Right?
So what's the significance of the title?
Oh yeah. It's almost, how can I put it? It comes out of his last novel, Just Above My Head. And Just Above My Head is the sprawling text, right? But there's this moment in the novel where the character is assessing what has happened in the aftermath of the civil rights movement. And he basically says something like this. He says, well, after the dream was shattered, referencing King's murder, some of us, we all scattered. Some of us were in jail. Some of us went mad. Some of us left the country. Some of us were killed and murdered. And then the character says, but responsibility isn't lost. Responsibility is abdicated. And if one refuses abdication, then one begins again. Mm-hmm. So it's this Sisyphean task, How do we roll this damn boulder up the hill again? Because these folk have done it again. Going back to what I was saying in the very beginning, right? What does it mean that every generation we have to figure out, right, how to call this country to its promise, how to insist on the principles of democracy? I said it yesterday on Nicole Wallace, as we're dealing with over 243 bills in 43 states aimed at curtailing the voting rights of Black and brown people in this country. And I said, I'll be damned. Here we are in 2021, still arguing over who has the right to vote. Still fighting over the basic instrument of American democracy, the most powerful instrument of American democracy. So beginning again is a mantra in some ways, that even in the face of the contradictions, even in the face of the betrayal, Brother Bud, we have to push this damn boulder up the hill again, right? We have to continue to figure out how to muster up the resources to try to hold America to its promise. Or to put it differently, how to imagine America otherwise.
There were three things in the book to which you draw repeated reference, and I would appreciate if you at least give kind of a definition and perhaps expansion on those. One was the big lie, and there were a couple of components to that big lie. That is stereotype that Black people are inferior, lies about American history, and rearranging events to fit the popular story about America. So the big lie.
Yeah, and it's really important, right? I remember asking Tim Snyder, the historian at Yale, about this question, because we use the big lie right now to refer to what has been said around the previous election, that somehow Democrats stole the election from Donald Trump, and how this question of electoral voter fraud has undermined our democracy. And what's behind that lie is the bigger lie. Because when we think about the sacking of the Capitol on January 6th, folks sacked the Capitol in the name of a certain conception of democracy, right? That the reason why the election was stolen is because of those voters in Atlanta, those voters in Philadelphia, those voters in Milwaukee and Detroit, right? Those are the places where the fraud was located, right? And that's because that's the place where Black and brown folk are, right? For the most part. So this idea that the country must be and remain this white nation in the vein of old Europe, that's the lie behind the other lie, right? This lie that only white people matter more, that white people ought to matter more than others. What I call in my book, Democracy in Black, the value gap. Well, the value gap, this belief that white people matter more than others, has organized our lives, our social, political, and economic arrangements. And we tell ourselves these stories, right, in order to protect ourselves from the fact that we've organized our world in this way. So Baldwin put it this way, I cite this on page 9 in the book, from an essay he wrote in 1964 entitled "The White Problem." And I'm paraphrasing here. He says, those Christians who founded the nation, had a fatal flaw. They came over saying that they were going to found a democracy, but they held chattel. And they had to figure out the role of this chattel in their lives, right? So what did they say? They said that these people who were chattel, this chattel, that these were not human beings, that these men and women were not human beings. Because if they were not human beings, Baldwin writes, then no crime would have been committed. And then he says, that lie is the basis of our present trouble. We tell ourselves the story that the wealth gap is a result of Black folks' inability to save. That somehow there's something about the tangle of pathology that defines our way of life that has kept us from, in some ways, accruing wealth. When we know that wealth in this country came about as a result of deliberate policy decisions that had everything to do with owning one's home. Okay, Columbus REALTORS, right? That had everything to do with who had access to home ownership. Thinking about the New Deal and those governmental policies that ushered in the vaunted American middle class, right? That moment in which FDR and those policies generated, right, the conditions under which the American middle class came into existence, Black folk were systematically denied access to the GI Bill. But we tell the story that the problem isn't us, the problem is actually them. Problem isn't that we deny Black folk access to home ownership. The problem is that they're not responsible enough to hold on, to own homes. Or when they do, they trash their neighborhoods and the value of those neighborhoods decline, right? As the justification for some kind of redlining practices, right? So we tell the story that the problem isn't, right, decisions that are predicated upon assumptions that certain people ought to be valued more than others. The problem is actually Black folk, brown folk, them. They're not quite like us. And so part of what I was trying to do in the first chapter is to say something that is fundamental. There's no way we're going to resolve the problems we face as a country if we keep lying to ourselves. There's no way we're going to resolve or respond to deep racial inequality if we don't tell ourselves the truth about how it happened. Anything based on a lie will be colored and shadowed by that lie. So first of all, we have to tell the truth about what we've done and who we are to release ourselves into the possibility of being different, to being otherwise. Yeah.
So you talked about the value gap. What about after times? I think that was
Yeah, you know, I'm a country boy from Mississippi. I know you're from Alabama, but I'm a country boy from Mississippi, and you know, I love the blues. I love Bobby Blue Bland in particular. But you know, Robert Johnson talks, you know, the so-called father of the blues. He talks about being at the crossroads where he made that deal with the devil, as it were.
yeah.
Well, the after times is a reference to the crossroads. That moment when an old world has died and a new world is struggling to come into being. That interregnum, that period of betwixt and between. And when I get the phrase from Walt Whitman and his wonderful book, Democratic Vistas. And Whitman is a complicated character, you know. I say that because Whitman, when you read his poem, Leaves of Grass, he's an abolitionist, he's anti-slavery. He even has a character in the poem who actually embodies slavery itself. But by the time you get to the last edition of Leaves of Grass, he's redacted that out of the poem. Because although Whitman was anti-slavery, he did not believe that Black people should have the benefits of citizenship. He thought we were barbarians, right? Incapable of exercising the burdens of citizenship. So when you read his op-eds from the newspapers in Brooklyn, right, it's clear that he thinks that Black folk are less than. But in Democratic Vistas, and I had to kind of come to terms with my own reading, vexed reading of Whitman. But in Democratic Vistas, he's trying to grapple with the fact that the nation has just come out of the carnage of the Civil War. All of those dead just ended slavery, and now Jim Crow is coming into existence, taking root in the South. And greed has overwhelmed the land. The dawning of the Gilded Age. That is spiritless, that something was closed, a world died, and now a world that was trying to come into existence was being snuffed out. So the after times is that period, that crossroads moment. Another way to put it, Brother Buzz, is this. At these moments of critical inflection, when the crown of the new America is showing, is about to be born, we realize that the umbilical cord of white supremacy is wrapped around the baby's neck, choking the life out of him. And every single time that a new America is about to be born, that happens. And we fail as midwives, right? So we're in those after times, trying to figure out who the hell are we? Who the hell will we be? Yeah, that's what I mean.
So it seems that a pivotal point was Mr. Baldwin meeting with a group of Howard University students, and he was asking something of them, and then he made a commitment to them, and that commitment seemed to be a thread that ran through the rest of the book and the rest of his life.
Yeah, you know, one of the things about Begin Again, the book, is that the spine of it is Baldwin's 1972 book, No Name in the Street. And it's the first book that Jimmy wrote after the assassination of Dr. King. And typically critics have said that this represents a decline in Baldwin's corpus, right? That he's too angry, he's too bitter, he's too polemical, he's given up on being an artist. He just wants to be a kind of politician of sort, an activist. I think they're wrong. And so there's this moment in '63, as you rightly know. And Baldwin, you know, he was invited to campus at Howard. Because Howard had this national action group, right, called NAG, this student organization called NAG. And they had helped, Joan Robinson in Cambridge, Maryland, in her efforts to desegregate schools and businesses in Maryland. Gloria Richardson, and many of those young students would go on to become very important leaders in SNP, Stokely Carmichael, Muriel Tillinghast, Michael Thelwell, Cortland Cox. These are some of the students in that apartment building, in that apartment late at night, and they're chopping it up till the sun comes out. Liquor stores have closed and Jimmy needs his Johnny Walker Black. Somebody knows that somebody knows a bootlegger. So they go out and find him some liquor. So they're chopping it up and he's drinking, he's taking it in. And so they asked him to say the final words. Now, Baldwin knew that these young SNCC activists had been in the bowels of the South. They had been in Alabama and Mississippi and Georgia, right? And they had seen raw terror and they were exhausted. He knew what they were experiencing, right? Because Birmingham was here, right? The bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church hadn't happened, but what Bull Connor was doing in Birmingham had already happened, right? And so Baldwin says to me, as if you says to these students, and he said it to me in some ways, if you promise your elder brother that you will not believe what this world says about you, then I promise you, I will never betray you. Now, 2 years later, 2.5 years later, Stokely Carmichael is finishing the March Against Fear with James Meredith in Mississippi. Gets locked up, he's in Greenwood, Mississippi, and he says, I'm not going to jail anymore. We're gonna stop saying freedom now, and we're gonna say Black Power. And he scared the hell out of everybody. And Jimmy said, no. You can't reject these young people because now they're screaming Black Power. These are your babies. Their anger is yours. You need to understand why they're shouting Black Power, right? And so part of why No Name is the spine of the book is because Baldwin is trying to make intelligible the radical shift in the Black freedom struggle, trying to make it make sense to those who want to say that this is just anger and rage, right? Unleashed, right? And the like. So that moment is really important because it's a moment of a declaration of responsibility and of love. And if you recall, Buzz, I end the book with young people trying to find Jimmy's grave. And these brothers, it's a multiracial group of brothers smoking woods, right? And it's the loudest smelling weed I've ever smelled in my life. And I stop them and I say, do you know where James Baldwin's grave is? And eyes ablaze. And they said, but he might be near Malcolm's grave. And Malcolm is over there. And I'm with Carol Weinstein, David Baldwin's partner, Baldwin's brother's partner. And she said, no, he's not buried over there. And then we come back and we find, and Jimmy's grave is right behind those young people, right next to them. And I remember when they said, is that where he is? And I said, yeah, he was here the whole time. Right there, the entire time. Young folk, declaration of responsibility, a declaration of love.
One of the things that he committed to doing was, and this is repeated throughout the book, and that's bearing witness, telling the story, making it real for those who refuse to believe that such a thing can happen or has happened or is happening. And his bearing witness seemed to be a focal point of much of his writing from that point forward.
Yeah, and even before then, when you think, he wrote a piece in the New York Review of Books, or it might have been the New York Times review, book review, entitled As Much Truth as One Can Bear. Wrote it in 1962. And it's an impious piece because he's reflecting on American writers, people like Dos Passos and Faulkner and Hemingway and the like. And he's saying that this younger generation, of whom he was an important figure, or emerging as an important figure, that what the obligation of the novelist is to tell the truth, to tell as much truth as one can bear. And then he has a comma. And then he says, and then some more. To tell the truth as much as one can bear, and then some more. So what Baldwin is saying in these moments, at least as I read him, is that as a writer, as a poet of sorts, the task is to bring into view those aspects of human experience, right, that we tend to shy away from, but reveal the depths of who we are, that disclose the panics and terrors of who we are, you see. And so Baldwin, as a witness, he's not only a witness in the sense of the Hebrew Bible, you know, the prophets of the Hebrew Bible, right? He's not simply bearing witness in that sense. He's also a witness in that romantic sense of Schiller and Goethe and those folks, right? That is bearing witness to the complexity of human doings and stuff, being that poet, as Emerson would say, who offers a certain angle on our experience to help us be otherwise, you see. So in some ways, what I'm trying to do in the book is to be a poet of sorts, to bear witness to our own times, to help us be otherwise as well. Yeah.
One of the things that I noted, and please correct me if I'm wrong about this,
Sure.
but it seemed to me that there was a parallel between Malcolm X and James Baldwin in the sense that they started out kind of with a narrow view, but as they grew, as they matured, they developed a world, a universal view of humanity that wasn't just focused on, for example, the freedom of, but that they saw brotherhood with respect to people all over. And I thought that I could see a parallel in that regard.
Well, they are connected, but the parallel isn't quite that, though. And let me explain what I mean. So when you read Notes of a Native Son, Baldwin's first book of nonfiction, because Go Tell It on the Mountain is published in 53. No Name in the Street comes out in 55, Giovanni's Room in 56. But Notes of a Native Son comes out in 55. In Notes of a Native Son, he has a couple of essays, Everybody's Protest Novel and Many Thousands Gone. And what he's doing in those essays, he's rejecting Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, likening Uncle Tom to Bigger Thomas's, to Richard Wright's Bigger Thomas in Notes of a Native Son. He's rejecting sentimentality, as it were, wanting to insist on the complex interior life of Black folk. But what he says in those early pieces, and these pieces were written in 1949, 1951, in those early years, is that the categories trap us, right? This narrow conception of race kind of blind us to the human being right in front of us. He doesn't want us to retreat to some sentimental idea of humanity as such, but the particularity of the human being right in front of us, we often lose sight of because we allow these categories, these stereotypes to do the thinking for us, and we're trapped. So Baldwin early on is trying to imagine a way of being together that doesn't run aground because of these categories of race. Now, what happens when King dies? Some might even say it's a bit earlier, when Emmett Till's body is, found in the Mississippi. Because you read Blues for Mr. Charlie, Baldwin is angry in that play, right? But others will say it's probably, I tend to argue after, he says after King's assassination that something broke in him, that something changed in him. And it doesn't mean that he gets narrow. It means that he's not as concerned about convincing white folks that they should not embrace this idea of the value gap. He spends his energy differently. So the parallel, I think, isn't so much in terms of moving from narrow conceptions of race to more universal ideas of human community. I think the parallel is their willingness to speak the truth, to bear witness, to give it straight, no chaser. You see, Malcolm evolves. Baldwin one might think that Baldwin evolves in the sense of his own kind of critique of capitalism, but for the most part, they're both particular kinds of prophets, as it were, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
there was a a quote that you uttered earlier on that's ignorance allied with power is the most ferocious enemy of justice. I actually, that's posted now on my wall that's there. I want, I want to, you had said earlier that we could ask you just about anything, but one of the things I want to ask you about is the murder of George Floyd and that infamous and painful 8 minutes and 46 seconds. It seemed to change the landscape with respect to a call for racial justice in America. Do you think that that event caused a fundamental change in attitudes of white people about race in the country? Do you think it's a permanent shift, or is it too early to tell?
Too early to tell. You know, it's a moment that it's a horrific moment. We've seen death on loop for years now. I mean, if I call the roll, my God, from Trayvon to Michael Brown to Ayanna Jones to Sandra Bland to, you know, Casey Goodson to, you know, I could keep going to Walter Wallace to, I could keep going on and on and on, you know. I think what happened is that COVID had us all sitting at our house, in our homes. And COVID was killing us indiscriminately, although it was killing some of us more than others. And so here we are, all feeling vulnerable in the middle of a global pandemic that has disrupted everything about our lives. And for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, we hear this grown man calling for his mama. For what? For what? And many of those young people that I was worried about with Black Lives Matter, worried about what they were doing, how they were holding up, it turned out that they were organizing still. And at the moment this happens, that organizing evidences itself across the country, you know? So I think there was this sense of, how can I put this? Of solidarity in collective vulnerability that made possible a moment of racial reckoning. You know, we're gonna have to change how we periodize American history now. There's pre-COVID and post-COVID. It used to be that way with the Civil War. The history of the country was told about by, you know, what was America like prior to the Civil War? What was America like post the Civil War? Ours will be pre-COVID, post-COVID. And the racial reckoning happened in the midst of this destabilization of our way of life. Now, there's a sociological paradox at the heart of American public opinion around race, Buzz. And that is, you can tell a story as Americans are asked particular questions about, say, racial school segregation, that their position in 1968 is very different than their position in 1998. In 68, you could hear more actually committed to racial segregation, the segregation of schools. By 1998, general consensus that schools should be integrated for the most part. So what you see in the public opinion data around race is this ongoing increase, liberalization, as it were, of American racial attitudes. But the paradox is that that increase, that change in racial attitudes is never, right, consistent with a commitment to actual policies to remedy racial inequality. So even as you have the change in attitudes around, you know, segregated schools, American schools today are as segregated as they were in 1968. So even though you have people saying after the murder of George Floyd that Black Lives Matter, you had this extraordinarily intense debate around defunding the police, around police reform, around criminal justice reform. So you have a shift in so-called opinion around Black Lives Matter, but you don't see any substantive shift in how we think about policing. We haven't seen it yet. So we got a long way to go. So the verdict is still out.
I know we just finished with Black History Month, and I've been in a number of discussions with people, and my feeling is I'm not a big fan of Black History Month. And I feel like we've been here 400 years, 365 days a year, 24/7. How do we tell our story as one that includes us, a people of color, as a part of the whole fabric of America?
Yeah, I mean, it's a challenging question. I'll come at it by way of example. So the New York Times with Nicole Hannah-Jones published the 1619 Project.
Uh-huh.
And the 1619 Project isn't so much an origin story as it is a suggestion around beginning the American story in a different place. The late critic Edward Said says the problem of beginnings is the beginning of the problem. Where you start matters, right? So the point that Nicole Hannah-Jones and others have made is that what happens to our story if we start at 1619 as opposed to 1776? Well, if we start at 1619, America was a corporation before it was a country. Fascinating.
Right.
If we start with 1619, suddenly native peoples, indentured servants, slaves are central to our beginning. But even more importantly, what becomes important is failure. The colony didn't survive in some ways. So that different narrative, that different beginning brings so much more into view than the kind of story of 1776. But even if we tell the story of 1776 and pay attention to what's around the legs of the table, I always say that the serpent wrapped around the legs of the table upon which the Declaration of Independence was signed. That same serpent is wrapped around the legs of the table upon which the Constitution was ratified. And is the serpent of slavery that threatens to swallow the entire project whole every generation. So it depends on where your eyes land, what comes into view. So part of the political work that we have to do is tell ourselves a different story. Because let me put it this way, and this may sound a little abstract, but it's not. The kinds of stories we tell ourselves actually reveal the limits of your conception of justice. If you tell a story in such a way that you're not paying attention to the beggar, if you tell a story in such a way that you're not paying attention to those who are locked out, if your Christianity isn't Matthew 25, but something else, right? We can go on and on and on and on, right? The way you narrate the story actually reveals the limits of your conception of justice. So we have to tell a different story about America, one that doesn't secure our innocence and virtue, but actually opens us up to becoming more mature human beings, if that makes sense.
Yes. You mentioned the Bible there. Was James Baldwin a person of faith? And how did he square the acts with the philosophy of Christianity, with talking about loving thy fellow man, or the second great commandment, love thy neighbor as thyself, with holding slaves, with the abuse really of other human beings? How did he square that?
He didn't. He didn't. In The Fire Next Time, published in 1963, there's that wonderful, powerful, provocative line. If the concept of God doesn't make you more expansive and more loving, then it's time we got rid of it. And then when you read his last essay published in Playboy magazine entitled To Crush a Serpent, it's a response to Jerry Falwell in The Moral Majority. And he offers an understanding of salvation and love, right? That isn't reducible to any kind of dogma, right? Baldwin wants us to understand the fullness of the human being right in front of us, right? That's the key.
One of the things that I think it was on page 50 that he commented on was the complex web of race and sex that immobilized the South. It seems to be those are still sensitive issues. And I think you'll appreciate this. My grandfather was not an educated man, once said to me, he said, son, he said, the only difference between the North and the South is in the South, they don't care how close you get as long as you don't get too big. And in the North, they don't care how big you get as long as you don't get too close. And so that complex web of race and sex seems to have not only immobilized the South, but obviously been transferred to the North.
Yeah, Baldwin is he's so insightful, you know. He understood the intimacy of it all. Yeah, the white Glaudes. Like my dad is my color, but all of his brothers and sisters are light skinned with green eyes. That didn't happen by accident.
My family.
You know? And so part of what he's trying to suggest here, right, is the relationship between, right, this ideology that demeans and degrades and disregards Black folk. But what happens under the cover of night? What happens, right, when desire interrupts and intercedes? He tells the story in No Name in the Street, a book, again, then that book published in 1972, of being sexually assaulted by this white liberal, right? Who could, with one phone call, could end a lynching or cause one. And he talks about the guy, you know, physically assaulting him, right? And looking in his wet eyes, which is an echo of sentimentality from Notes of a Native, from Many Thousands Gone and Notes of a Native Son. And he says there's something about a loveless touch that reveals the depth of despair in the heart. You see? There's something about the intimacy of it all. Something that we're denying. You know, something that we don't want to see up close. And Baldwin was right there. Here was this queer Black man, right, who understood where desire fit in it all, who tried to give us a sense of this, of the consequence of our refusal to deal with the panic at the root, right? The panic at the root of it all, the terror at the root of it all. So if we're going to understand the South, and let me just be clear, the South is a metaphor for America. As Malcolm says, as long as you're south of the Canadian border, you're in the South. He's talking about us. He's talking about all of us.
So how do you think that James Baldwin's sexuality, it seemed to me there was a point where I felt like some of the criticism that was leveled at him had to do with his sexuality as opposed to his product, his writing.
Well, you know, think about it, man. He writes Go Tell It on the Mountain. That's his first novel. And typically when you write that first book and it's just commercial success, they want you to write the same book over and over and over and over again, right? So he drops Go Tell It on the Mountain, then Notes of a Native Son comes out, and his next novel is Giovanni's Room. And Giovanni's Room is it's a love story, but it's a same-sex love story in 1956. And Baldwin would say, you're not gonna hold that over me, I told you. He couldn't get that novel published in the United States. He had to get it published in the UK. And it's a beautiful novel, right? And when I interviewed Angela Davis for the book, the heroic figure of Black power, big Afro Angela Davis, brilliant philosopher Angela Davis. And she said, in so many ways, Jimmy was out there all by himself. Because here he was out. He wasn't Bayard Rustin, who was queer, but wasn't out. Baldwin was out, right, in this period and was unashamed about it, right? You can't hold this over me, I told you. And so I think there is a sense in which he challenged certain conceptions of Black politics. He damn sure challenged certain understandings of Black masculinity, right? But I like to tell this story all the time. When Baldwin was at an event at the Black Panther Party, a Black Panther Party event, helping raise money, even though Eldridge Cleaver thought he was a self-hating Negro. And a man who was having a gun, had an epileptic seizure. And he starts shooting the gun in the air. Now, Baldwin's on stage with Betty Shabazz, the widow of Malcolm X, and their children. When the gunshots go off, everybody runs. they scatter, right? You hear Baldwin scream, the babies, and he runs and he goes and covers them. So there's all of this question about his so-called manhood, right? No, this queer Black man exhibited courage in ways that were unimaginable, you know.
So I wanted to get to this part here.
Sure.
Donald Trump and the truth. Now, I know that some people would consider that to be an oxymoron, but I've repeatedly heard people consider him to be an exception to the attitudes that are held by most white people in America.
Yeah, I want to read. So let me, how can I put this? Because this is really important for what we're trying to do with this conversation. Americans tend to think of race in melodramatic terms, like we're watching All My Children, or One Life to Live, or Young and the Restless. Am I dating myself? Bold and the Beautiful.
Yeah.
You know, in those Mississippi summers when it was too hot and we had to stay inside, and my mother only watched the ABC soap opera, so, and wouldn't let us turn the channel. But when I say we take a soap opera like view or a melodramatic view, that melodrama involves being able to clearly identify villains and clearly identify heroes. So when we read the American racial landscape or read Donald Trump within the frame of melodrama, he either becomes villain or hero. If he's villain, we can displace all of our sins onto him and just say, if only we got rid of him, we'll be okay. When in fact, it's much more complicated, much more layered. It's not about one singular bad figure. This is about us. We made him possible. Our daily choices, not the choices of the loud racists. That's easy. That's too easy. The loud racists are easy. But those who don't want their schools to be integrated because they're worried about what's going to happen to the quality of instruction. And usually there is a definite correlation between how many Black and brown folk attend the school with the assumption that the school isn't highly functioning. You know this, you sell houses.
Yeah.
Right? Our neighborhoods. I want my neighborhood to be my, you know, we live in these segregated environments, right? Why? Because there are these ongoing assumptions among people who aren't loud racists who say, I want my home to maintain its value, understanding that if a community becomes integrated, that somehow I'm going to lose the value of my home. It's going to decrease. We're making choices day in and day out that aren't the choices of loud racists, but are the choices of those who are content with a society predicated upon the belief that some people ought to matter more than others, you see. So when we blame Donald Trump, when we read him as the exception, the problem is him or was him, then we don't understand that 243 pieces of legislation have just been submitted in 43 states to disenfranchise American citizens. Donald Trump didn't do that. He didn't do that. Or he's not the ones who, these militias and white supremacist organizations, Proud Boys, he's not the source of that. We are. If we're going to be otherwise, we got to tell the truth. And that's not to beat ourselves over the back. It's actually to clarify the choice in front of us. If you don't tell yourself the truth, then you're not going to be able to make the right choice. And another generation will have to deal with this nonsense.
Thank you. It was actually maybe a great segue opportunity making reference to the legislation. We do have some questions that have come up, and we actually have some of our elected officials that are on the line. I'd like to take this opportunity, Dr. Glaude, to introduce you, if you haven't already met. Our Congresswoman, Congresswoman Joyce Beatty, would like to present you with a question. Congresswoman Beatty, would you please unmute yourself and ask?
Well, thank you so much, Michael. Thank you, Buzz. I am a big fan, unapologetic about it. I have read much of your work, but my question goes to, especially in your democracy in Black. book. As chair of the powerful Congressional Black Caucus in our 50th anniversary this year, where do we go from the January 6th insurrection of the United States Capitol with white supremacy on display, still needing to reauthorize the Voting Rights Act, and still a white officer can put his knee on a Black man's neck, George Floyd, 8 minutes and 46 seconds. What would you say to us?
Well, you know, we have to pass the George Floyd Act. And that's baseline, right? Because we got to get rid of unqualified immunity. We have to, in some ways, decriminalize the code. You can damn near sneeze in the United States and break a law. So we have to figure out in so many ways how to decrease the number of contacts between our community and policing. Think about how many folk get in trouble just because they're walking in the street. Mike Brown might still be here, if you think about that, right? Or, you know, Cash Rebel, Sandra Bland might still be here. So there's some baseline things that the George Floyd Act make possible. But I think this, Congressman, and first of all, I am so excited, I'm just giddy looking at you on Zoom and your leadership for the CBC, right? I think we need a broad public infrastructure of care to shift the axis of debate. And what do I mean? Not a social safety net, but a broad infrastructure of care, which has at least 3 legs to it. One, COVID-19 has revealed the depth of the problems of healthcare within our community and across the board. We need to have a social contract with each other that says, if you get sick, we got you. But you're not going to lose your livelihood because you're sick. That's one thing. We're going to have also a living wage that if you're working 40 hours a week, not only should you have the ability to put food on the table and keep a roof over your head, right? You can send your kids to college. We're going to insist on a living wage. That's our contract with each other. And lastly, we're going to shift the discussion from law and order to safety and security. Because law and order has led to locking up millions of our fellow Americans that have devastated our communities. We're going to change the nature of criminal justice. We're going to change the nature of policing in this country. And we're going to say that safety is much more than just simply policing communities. Safety involves social services. It involves education. It involves a whole range of things. So every community deserves to be safe and secure, not resource deprived, not hyper-concentrated areas of poverty and the like. So I think we need a broad public infrastructure of care, an investment in each other, predicated upon a new social and moral contract. Because you know what? They've shredded the old one. In the name of what? You see what I'm suggesting? But in the midst of that, can I just be a fanboy?
Let me just, no, thank you. You have given me so much. I have been taking notes and certainly don't want to overstep John or Michael or Buzz, but we certainly would love to invite you to have a dialogue with the Congressional Black Caucus. On behalf of Jim Clyburn and Hakeem Jeffries, we would certainly welcome that. Thank you, and thank you to all my fellow friends and colleagues for allowing me to join.
Thank you, Congresswoman Beatty, and thank you for asking, an important question. And Dr. Glaude, thank you for continuing to be generous with your time and answer questions. We also have another elected official. We have our local commissioner, Mrs. Marilyn Brown. Marilyn, if you would please unmute yourself.
Thank you. And I too am a big fan. And the question that I have is related to the issues you've just spoken of. How can those of us who are not supporters of the Trump policies and those who have been related to the insurrection and those of us who want to be helpful and be on the front lines with those who want to speak out to support the agenda of Black Lives Matter and the Black community and Brown community and those who have been more vulnerable in our communities, how can we be helpful to speak out? Because it can't be just the Black and brown communities speaking to each other. And you need allies. And it's been very difficult to have a voice in the conversation in our community, because the Black and brown communities have wanted to only speak, and we've not been given the ability to speak out. Those of us who want to do that. Any suggestions?
So let me just be honest. I'm out here struggling just like everybody else. I don't have all the answers. You know, just because I'm on television and I'm a pundit sitting here talking with Joe Scarborough doesn't mean that I know everything. So I want to admit that up front. Let me say a couple of things really quickly. One of the questions that Baldwin loathed, he hated this question, was what else does the Negro want? He hated that question. And the reason why he hated the question is because he said it revealed that the person asking it did not think of him as a human being equal to themselves, because they would know immediately what he wanted. He would want the same thing you want, right? So the first thing the question does, it disrupts what often is a problem. That is, we view racial justice or racial equality as a philanthropic enterprise, as a charitable gesture, as something we can do to give to others. When in fact, what we need to be asking ourselves is, what is our conception of justice? If you have a conception of justice that everyone should be treated equally under the law, then you know what you should be doing, because we know in the United States, everyone's not treated equally under the law. If you have a conception of justice that if you work 40 hours a week, that you should make a living wage, that you shouldn't be busting your behind working 40, 50, 60 hours a week, and you can barely put food on the table, keep a roof over your head, and send your kid to college. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, what is your conception of justice? What does a just society look like to you? And then once you answer that question, now we are in the space for solidarity, not for charity, but for solidarity. Baldwin would always say, I'm suspicious of folk who want to do something for me as opposed to with me. I love that formulation, you see. So the thing I'm asking is, what is your conception of justice? What is your idea of a just society? And then we can begin, once you've answered that question, we can begin to single out those spaces of synergy where we can do work together to bring about the New Jerusalem, to bring about a more just world. And to echo Cornel West, what is justice? But, you know, justice is what love looks like in public.
Absolutely. And I think you're absolutely right. It's what do we do together to make a more just society for everybody?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Thank
So
you so
thank
much.
you.
I appreciate it.
Dr. Glaude, we had a question about who are the James Baldwins of today?
Outside of the people named James Baldwin, I don't know. And I'm gonna put it that way, Lynn, because we don't need James Baldwin today. We need particular voices of our time. Somebody was asking James Baldwin who was going to be the next Ernest Hemingway, who was going to be the next Richard Wright. And James Baldwin was like, I'm James Baldwin. That nostalgic longing for the past is an abdication of the responsibility for the present. We are the new giants. So the question is not who's the new James Baldwin. The question is, who Tanika gonna be? Where James at? Where Jimmy at? Where Pookie and them at? Who's gonna step into the breach and give voice to, right, the need and desires of our moment? We have to step into that breach. Now, there are going to be a whole bunch of folks who are influenced by it. There are going to be a whole bunch of folks who might be named the next one. Some people name Ta-Nehisi Coates the next James Baldwin. That's nonsense. Ta-Nehisi Coates is Ta-Nehisi Coates. That's who he is. You know, I think we don't need a new Toni Morrison. Read Jessamine Ward. Extraordinary novelist. How can I put this, Lynn? I don't want to stand in a sycophantic relationship to the past. I want the past to be the wind beneath my wings.
You had a question you wanted to ask Dr. Glaude?
Oh, I'm unmuted. Thank you. He did address it, and I
Oh, okay.
was asking that he expounded on what can you do for me? What can we do together? And I really appreciate that. Thank you very much.
And I think this is really important, John, that we emphasize this. If we shift from a charitable model, from a philanthropic model, suddenly diversity, equity, and inclusion isn't an additive value, it becomes a constitutive value. It's not something that we're doing for someone, it's something we're doing consistent with who we take ourselves to be. So if your conception of justice entails that everyone should be treated equally under the law, that everyone should not only have the opportunity to dream dreams, but to make those dreams a reality, then you will commit yourselves to doing the sort of work in the various spaces that you happen to occupy to making that happen. We need to figure out how to live together differently. And those of you who are in this business, you are on the front lines. We have to figure out how to no longer be walking mysteries to each other, right? And that involves how we live together, it seems to me. But who am I? I'm just an academic.
And Dr. Glaude, I'm glad you said that. And Michael made a comment last year that we need to partner as we make the move, instead of taking it from words to action, but partner and bring people in to work together. And that is something that we want to continue to live by. And it's the celebration of culture, accepting and knowing the cultures, not trying to become one culture, but the celebration and acceptance. And that is one of the small steps that we're taking of celebrating culture. But with Michael's words of us partnering, bringing people in together, and not try to do this alone, is the only way we're going to make the change that needs to be made.
Yeah, and I would say that on behalf of those in the tradition out of which I come, we have to stop quieting ourselves. We can no longer mute ourselves as a condition for acceptance, right? I have to bring the fullness of who I am into every space that I occupy. And I cannot concede to the demand that I make myself small. I tell my son this, I tell my students this, I tell myself this. The world conspires to make you small. The question is whether you're going to be complicit. I don't want to be complicit with being made small any longer.
Buzz, do you have any other questions? And thank you for allowing us to jump in.
Yes, without a doubt. I think we're just about out of time. I did want to touch on just one other thing, and that was, do you think that the insurrection of January 6th and the fact that the very Monday after that, there were 253 bills in 43 states that were passed to suppress voting rights, do you think that that blatant appeal to racist behavior will give Congress a mandate to pass H.R. 1 and the John Lewis Voting Act?
Not sure. See, the thing is that we have to read January 6th as the logical extension of the backlash to the Black freedom struggle of the mid-20th century. See, we're still playing on the field of Reagan. Let's be clear. 1968, what is the response to the assassination of Dr. King? The response is Nixon.
Yeah.
He's elected twice. 12 years later, Reagan is elected to undo it all. People forget that folk thought Reagan was going to cause World War III. George H. Walker Bush called his economic philosophy voodoo economics.
Yeah.
We've been playing on the field determined by Reagan. The assumptions, the background conditions. What has it led to? It's led to extraordinary gaps between those who have and those who don't have. It's led to the devastation of the planet where 100-year storms are now occurring every other week, right? And the backlash, the game, the political playbook of playing to people's fears and grievances and hatreds. It has now consumed the Republican Party, right? It has consumed it. So what January 6th represents is the extension, the continuation of that backlash, the view that this country must remain white and those who are not white need to shut up and be grateful.
So
And that was the spectacle. That was the spectacle. So what we're seeing now, and you know this in the state of Ohio, y'all might be located in a particular bastion, but outside of where you are, right? There is this ongoing view that the browning of the country, the demographic shifts of the country, are ominous shadows or ominous clouds of what's to come. There's no guarantee that HR 1 or SR 1 will pass. There's no guarantee that they're going to narrow the range of the filibuster such that the Senate can actually do the people's business. I'm from the Gulf Coast, as I said. I've grown up in some hurricanes. And you know, if you've been through a hurricane, I'm gonna sound country here, y'all. When you've been through a hurricane, the front end of a hurricane is powerful. It'll tear that place up. And then there's the calm of the eye. But then the tail's coming. The tail is as powerful as the front end. We still got the tail coming. We're still in the storm, y'all. We're still in the storm.
I want to end with one thing that you said on Tuesday that I thought was really powerful, and that's you were talking about that a mother and father, Black mother and father, that it was very difficult for them to raise a child, or no, that they could not make a difference in that child, and it was so contrary to, I thought, what was public rhetoric about that. Do you remember that?
Yeah, I was talking about, this goes back to a point we made earlier about racial inequality being the result of deliberate choices, of deliberate policy decisions, that there's nothing that Black parents can do collectively to close the achievement gap. Studies show all the time. It doesn't mean every Black parent in the United States could end up you could be involved in PTA, could do all sorts of things, but that can't close the achievement gap. It's going to require directed policy. There's nothing that we can do individually to close the wealth gap. It's going to require direct policy, because policy brought it into existence. Policy has to be its remedy. But you have to tell yourself the truth to even get there. If you refuse to tell yourself the truth, then you're just going to pass the buck.
Well, we're out of time, unfortunately. When I was putting together these questions, I thought, oh man, are we going to be able to fill this time? I think we could fill like another couple of hours. What I want to say is, I think we all ought to unmute and just give you an ovation, man. I'm telling you, really and truly, this was just fantastic, fantastic. I, on behalf of Columbus Realtors, want to thank you so very much for taking the time. It has been an elucidating hour, and I look forward to reading more of your work. And thank you so much for all that you do. Thank you for bearing witness and not being silent.
Well, y'all be safe out there now, and take care of yourselves, and have a great weekend. Take care.
Right.
Bye-bye.
And Buzz, I want to thank you personally, and Dr. Glaude, thank you so much for being here. Congresswoman Beatty and Commissioner Brown for joining us, and all of our guests. But this would not have taken place today. We have an opportunity to talk to the CEO of Coldwell Realty, but we would not be able to do this today without our relationship with Realtus, Kiana. I thank you so much for being here and part of this, our Diversity and Equity and Inclusion Committee, as well as NAR, National Association of Realtors, and Coldwell Realty for helping us put this wonderful event on with such a powerful message and guest. And again, this is just the beginning. We cannot do this with one event. We have to do this with an ongoing, non-stop focus on making the change that we need to make. We don't want this to become a product or a program. this is becoming our culture of change. So thank you again, Dr. Glaude, and we're very excited to be able to have the CEO of Coldwell Banker Realty, Ryan Gorman, with us today to ask a couple questions, because Coldwell Banker has done a number of made a number of decisions to make change within their organization, not just with Coldwell Banker Realty, but with Realty on a national basis. And Ryan, I'm so glad you're able to join us. I wanted to ask a couple questions, if you don't mind. And it's great to see you again from our days together at Realty.
Yeah, good to see you as well. And thank you for having me. I was excited to join until I realized that my joining meant that Dr. Glaude stopped. I'd rather go back on mute and listen to more of that conversation, honestly.
Well, we can absolutely, if you have some questions for Dr. Glaude, then we can continue as well, because the two of you can actually work close together, as we are working very close together. But a number of years ago, Ryan, Realty, I think it was 8 years ago, they received the award for the most ethical company in the United States. And that was led by your Chief Operating Officer, Liz Geringer, who was with Realty at the time. But can you just tell us what you are doing at Coldwell Banker to continue the process that you started years ago, the work that you do with all of the entities such as NARAB and NAREP and ARIA, LGBT Real Estate Alliance? Tell us, what are you doing as an organization to make sure that this focus stays ahead of you and with all of your team throughout the United States?
Well, again, I appreciate the opportunity to join. It's a great question, and believe it or not, it's actually been 10 years now for the world's most ethical company list. But what you just mentioned, as you're wrapping up with Dr. Glaude, is exactly what the focus needs to be, and the only thing that's been successful for us, which is making something part of your culture, such that you really, I think, have to go above and beyond at all times to make sure that you're living that in every moment. So, for instance, a consumer complaint comes in, an employee has a question about whether something was done correctly. An agent wonders whether or not there's been sufficient disclosure about something. That can't be, the reaction cannot be anything other than full force, full-throated, taking that head on and saying, we understand the question, we appreciate the question, we want to give you an answer, and we want the actual facts to be in line with what you would expect from the world's most ethical company. A really interesting thing happens with that, the fact that that has been out there, and Liz Geringer, who was the chief ethics and compliance officer at the time, she's a phenomenal individual. We're lucky that Coldwell Banker gets her all to ourselves now. She's really just a phenomenal professional. She created that ingrained culture in so many ways, in so many facets, large and small. But the best thing that happened was people started to hold us accountable to that, which is a lot of what I keep asking people to do now for a lot of what we're trying to do with our inclusive ownership program and other things. In other words, they'll throw it at you if they think you've fallen down on the job, which is exactly what should happen. Someone will say, hold on a second, is this the kind of thing the world's most ethical company would do? Or I had an experience as a consumer. I got a call 2 nights ago from California. A consumer bought a house and they weren't happy with something having to do with the hot water heater. And they said, the world's most ethical company would make this right. And that's exactly what we need. We may not always agree on every hot water heater out there, but we need people to hold us accountable to what we've decided we want to be. And with a lot of what we're doing with inclusive ownership and some other things we can talk about, that's one of the first things that I'm asking everyone to do, is hold us accountable to live what we say we're going to do, but then even more importantly, hold us accountable to the results. There's words, there's action, and then there's results. Hold us accountable to the actual results. Tell me, when you hear me speaking about something, hey, I've heard that story 5 times now, where's the result? Where is the thing that you said was going to happen? That's what needs to be the demand on us. And honestly, I think it's the only way that, especially in an industry as large as ours, or a company as large as ours, I think it's the only way outcomes really occur.
How are you working with the other brands under the Realty banner? And also, I know that you have such a commitment to the associations around the United States, working with other brands outside of Realty. What is that messaging internally and externally that you're bringing to the table to get everybody to collaborate together?
Sure. I mean, Dr. Glaude said it well in terms of decide sort of what you actually want. He said it much more eloquently than I ever could, but essentially decide what world you want to live in and then beat a path toward that world. So for us, with, for instance, the inclusive ownership program, we decided, we within Coldwell Banker, but now I think all of Realty has decided, we're just not serving communities well enough. So I personally very deeply believe that a real estate agent, a subject matter expert, a trusted advisor is the single best person to help someone step into home ownership in a way that is, it meets their aspirations, but they're also doing it safely for themselves, financially safely. They're not getting caught up in some of the worst of the financial products that have been out there. They're not stepping into a home that isn't going to meet their needs, et cetera. That means that we need professionals serving all communities. And if we believe that we invest in our professionals to make sure that they are truly the best in the business, and that means we need to be serving all communities. So if you just start with Coldwell Banker, let alone the other brands, we took a hard look at, especially following the Great Recession, a lot of brokerages had to, a lot of agents had to exit the business. A lot of brokerages had to shrink back during the Great Recession. And that oftentimes meant exiting, serving certain communities, moving offices, closing offices. A lot of companies just folded during that downturn, and they have not been replaced across the country. I mean, this is true for almost every brand, but for Coldwell Banker, which we have responsibility for, we were not then serving all of those communities that we wish to serve. So if we need to, then how do we ensure that we're working with individuals in that community, deciding what listening to what's being requested of us to be able to help better serve those areas, and then delivering that at a very high level. And so the inclusive ownership program, for instance, that we launched back in February of 2020, seems like eons ago, was really designed to meet a need to be able to launch in many of the communities that we had not been sufficiently serving. Now, when we did that, a lot of people reached out to us because it sounded sort of too good to be true. Frankly, that was the feedback that we got initially. We launched it at NAREB conference in Las Vegas, and the first 100 questions I got were some version of "I don't believe you," because it just seemed a little bit too kind of over the top. We got a lot of calls. I got a lot of calls that I won't mention the names of the companies, but our competitors who said, like, I want to understand this better because I think I share your aspiration, but I think you might be crazy. So let me just understand exactly what you're doing and seeing whether or not we can invest similarly to achieve a similar goal. In the building within Realty, we have all these other brands, Sotheby's International Realty, Better Homes and Gardens, ERA, Century 21, et cetera, and Corcoran. These brands are now going to be adopting essentially the inclusive ownership program and spreading it throughout. So that's a great example of, we may have been the first to step out there, but across Realty, you're going to have that kind of opportunity, and really across the industry. NAR and other groups have also reached out to say, we want to understand, so we can, if you're okay with it, we want to understand your program and share some of the aspects of it and how it's gone for you. And we said, perfect. That's the goal. This is not supposed to be a differentiated advantage for Coldwell Banker. This is actually us just trying to step into a very different space with regard to residential real estate in general.
And with your leadership, it's wonderful to hear this momentum and this energy. But no different than here at Columbus Realtors, after the murder of George Floyd, we made a commitment that we cannot be focused for this during this passionate time, that it has to continue. We have to make sure this becomes part of our culture. This is a very strong initiative that you're putting on, that you are rolling out. How do you keep that momentum? How do you keep that focus and energy, not just through 2021, but the next 2, 5, 10 years, and it becomes your culture?
Yeah, I think I long ago and far away, I used to be a high distance runner. I'm not anymore, nowhere near it. But at the time, people used to ask me, hey, I think I want to run a marathon. What should I do? And I always told them the first thing you should do is tell everyone you know that you're going to run a marathon, because then you will feel such guilt and shame that you will go out and do it. It might kill you, but you will run 26.2 miles on the day of the marathon, because everyone's going to hold you accountable. And I feel similarly about this program. It's one thing to announce, I'm going to get in shape. It's another thing to say, I'm going to run the New York City Marathon. With this program, we're going to run the New York City Marathon. So we announced the program, we put it out there, too much fanfare. We publish it, we put it in our federal disclosure documents. It's irretrievable. It's unrecoverable. We can't back away from that now. And it's quite on purpose. We didn't want the temporary tattoo. We got the real ink. We decided that we actually aspire to this outcome, and we want the industry to hold us accountable to reaching this. An example that just happened the other day, an individual who heard about our program had applied, and she was told that sorry, in the territory where you applied, we have really massive market share and your office is like right up against another office. It's not going to really work out. And she emailed me and she said, look, with all due respect, I heard what you said you wanted to do. So solve this problem. Because if you want me and brokers like me in your program, then solve this problem. So we worked together all weekend to come up with a solution that we think actually works. And I hope that she's going to be one of our newest brokers. That's a perfect example, though. I don't think she would have tried to hold me accountable unless we'd been so clear and so bold about asking for the accountability and deciding exactly what the outcomes are that we want. And we're just getting started. I mean, while we've gotten credit for the program, it's a drop in the bucket. The problem is enormous. I don't have to tell this group. The problem is enormous. And the ultimate goal is for instance, if you really want to hold us accountable and say, well, how should we measure this program? One measurement is Black family home ownership rates in the United States. If we're saying we're designing this program to be able to make sure that trusted advisors exist and serve all communities across the country, and that we want to be part of that, then the natural outcome should be, we're not obviously the only ones controlling it, but the natural outcome should be an increase in the home ownership rate for those families who aspire to step into home ownership. That's the ultimate report card. There's interim report cards between here and there, but that's the ultimate report card for us and probably for our industry.
And that's great leadership that she could reach out to you and you responded to her. And that's the very important part, that shield, that layer you've taken down if you're truly going to roll something out like this and make it work long term. How does your competition, you mentioned competition, and when it comes to this issue, we really don't have competition. We have to work together. Have you reached out to leaders of the other brands as a discussion of how you can work together to collaborate and roll this out at a larger scale?
Yeah, we have. So our program is relatively unique to us, but those conversations have happened. I think one of the beautiful things about our industry is, and it's mostly beautiful, some days it's a little bit less beautiful, is we need to cooperate with our competitors on every single transaction, right? If we're serving the buyer and seller of a property, we are most likely coordinating with a competitor in order to do that. And yet we do it because there's a higher goal in mind. There's a service that we're looking to work toward. And so we do it, and we do it well, and we develop friendships. I mean, a lot of our agents working out in marketplaces around there are friends with their competitors because they've worked together enough to grow respect. And that's true among the leadership of a lot of the largest companies out there. We might have different approaches, but we're having conversations around these outcomes. So not all of them are as comfortable with some of the things that we proposed, but they have some of their own paths. And so what many of them initially did was they said, because a lot of what I emphasized was listening. Not like I don't actually have the answers, but I can try and put myself in some spaces with people who at least can give me some insight and make some proposals that we can then act on. And for a lot of them, they realized that they hadn't really done that. They had created maybe structures, maybe the equivalent of diversity and inclusion council type of things in different places, but they personally, the CEO, wasn't necessarily involved in that. I don't think they thought they were neglecting it in any way, but they weren't in the room. They weren't in the conversation. And so now they've committed to stepping into the room and into the conversation and putting themselves in the line of accountability for the outcomes, so that it's not a listening tour anymore. It's more of an action planning tour. And I think it's an awesome first step. And I honestly haven't seen outcomes from it yet, but that doesn't mean they're not happening. It just means for some of these groups, it takes a little bit of time to formulate a different approach to a franchise system. For instance, you file federal documents and all this kind of thing. But I really do think you're going to see that this year. You're going to see some announcements from some of our competitors to create some programs that have the same goal. They might look different than ours, but with the same goal.
And there's a simple reality to the world we live in right now. You're going to have pushback. You're going to have detractors from this. And we heard this from Dr. Glaude as well. How are you handling that pushback internally within your own staff and pushback within your franchisees or Coldwell Banker Realty itself? How are you addressing that issue?
Well, I get a lot of email. I send a lot of email. We have 100,000 people around the country, around the world, and I send out messages. If you send 100,000 emails, you're going to get responses. And some people are not going to be happy with whatever you said. Even if you told them where to go to pick up their check, you're going to get some people that, requested a direct deposit, right? That's going to be some of the feedback. So I can tell you, when we launched the inclusive ownership program, there was a lot of really strong positive feedback. There was a fair bit of very negative feedback. And it was, much of it started honestly with expletives of people just sort of, having a mindset of no one ever gave me anything. And it feels like you're giving other people something that I've had to sort of pay for all my life. Now, I always say feedback is a gift. It's a very common expression. Sometimes it takes reminding yourself that a few dozen times before you believe it. I respond 100% of the time. So it's me holding myself accountable. Anybody out there wants to email me, I will get back to you probably before I go to sleep at night. And I engage 100% of the time. And I say, I appreciate the perspective. I do disagree, but let me clarify a couple of things from your message. 99% of the time, and I mean it, 99% of the time, they usually respond with, I cannot believe you replied to me given I just cursed you out. That's pretty impressive. Two, I actually didn't know some of the things that you shared. I still don't agree with you, but I didn't know it. And three, I've got some respect now for either you or the brand or something else that I did not have. Interestingly, some of those folks who reached out to me initially have actually become referral sources for us, where they have run into brokers in their own marketplace and said, I still don't like your program, but I think this broker might be perfect for it, which is fascinating for someone who thought that this was unfair in the first place to say, you know what, I respect you and I respect where you're going. It reminds me of some of these lawmakers who are too few, I think, who are actually trying to work with people who don't agree with them to serve a higher goal. Agents who are competing with one another for the same listing, but then work together to get that deal done and get that deal closed. So it's been really incredibly impressive. It takes, a little bit of a thick skin, but if you engage, at least my finding anyway, if you engage with as much openness as you can muster, and you might need to take a breath before replying, then the results are really shocking. Like for me, it's been life-changing. To the past year's worth of that dialogue back and forth, it has changed my perception of humanity in a pretty profound way.
I have one more question. I've actually unmuted Kiana. I'd like, Kiana, if you have a question, but I just have one quick question for you, Ryan. Working with your organizations throughout the United States, what about the local associations such as Columbus Realtors? Are you engaged with the associations to look at working with the different entities such as NARAB and LGBTQ and the Real Estate Alliance? How are you addressing the associations and working closely with them?
One of the best things we've done, and we're nowhere near done yet, but what we've launched, it's been a couple of years now. We've got some events like our Agents of Change events and our Managers Change events, but our diversity, equity, and inclusion councils that we've stood up, which again are designed to live on, not to be a moment in time or a specific event. Standing those up have created the place for some of the more local and frankly more impactful relationships that we can start. So having an organization that lives on in Ohio or lives on here in my backyard in New Jersey, that engages with local associations, engages with some of our competitors as well, who just have similar ambitions, that then creates a virtuous cycle of people saying, well, wait a second, I think we can work together on something. And one of the things that oftentimes comes up first is applying a racial equity lens to significant decisions that are coming before an association or a board or a legislature that oftentimes happens. So, a racial equity lens, or in the case of environmental justice with a lot of racial inequity in some of the environmental side, I recommend a book called Toxic Communities. That just application of that lens to some of the community-based and real estate-based decisions can have some really significant changes. So for us, the structure of those councils, which we fund and facilitate, but it's all the volunteers who are really making it happen. That's the structure for that local engagement to really become something real, for a proposal to come up and be worked by the team and result in an actual either action or request for us to perhaps fund something to take action.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I'm going to ask Kiana if you have a question. Kiana and I have been working very close together. We're actually working very closely with Convergence here in Columbus, and we're co-chairing one of the committees on Convergence. It's very important to build that relationship that we have with Realtors and NARAB. So Kiana, thank you for joining us today. Do you have a question for Ryan?
Well, Ryan, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here first and foremost. And it's very interesting to have this conversation because I recently learned as early as this morning about the program you just discussed. And it was very interesting to hear that. So to hear you talk about that now is awesome. One question I would just like to ask, because we do focus on the home ownership side and the community side of things. I'm not sure what the breakdown is with regards to minority agents in your business, but is there any additional support or resources that you provide for any of your minority agents to provide them any additional assistance?
That's a great question. I'm glad you heard about the program today. And it's a great question too. You said, for instance, you don't know the composition of our agents. Unfortunately, nor do we. So we have a voluntary self-reporting approach for people who want to self-identify within our system, but we don't actually have a very good idea. So we went out and purchased third-party information where we just provide, for instance, names and email addresses to these groups that aggregate data and ask them to tell us what they think our composition is, right? And then try to match that up against our internal information. It was pretty different. So it was interesting. We did that for the first time last year, a year and a half ago, and we're going to do it again this year. What we do know is it is not diverse enough. What we do know is we are not reflective of the country for sure. We're not even reflective of many of the communities that we want to serve. So we have a long way to go. Part of the steps that we're taking there is on the employee base. So for instance, our office managers who are leading our offices throughout the country on the company-owned side, Coldwell Realty, for instance. When we hire now, we make sure to keep the position open to have a diverse slate. So we essentially try to generate applicants for a position until we actually have diversity among the applicants, and then we begin the interview process to be able to staff. Now, that's not a panacea. That doesn't necessarily change all of the, for instance, the recruiting that takes place, but it helps that we went from about a 2% internal hire rate, meaning about 2% of our managers came from our agent ranks, came from outside of our agent ranks, to about 42% when we implemented that. So in just a span of 2 years, if we needed a different composition, then we needed to invite in a lot of different voices into the conversation and have them do a lot of the work in the community. So that helped pretty significantly. Now, most recently, as we've launched things like our Agents of Change events, those groups and the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Councils have come forth with certain requests. So for instance, part of the inclusive ownership program includes financial support and mentorship for the franchisees who join that program. One of the most recent requests has been, well, what about our agents who are small business owners as well, looking to step into this business? A lot of the requests I've gotten have been more along the lines of sort of scholarship for getting a license and sort of getting up and running. And we have tried that in a few different places, honestly, just not with a lot of success. I'd like to run a few more experiments to be able to try some things to see if we have a different level of success on a broader scale. And that's a lot of the things that we're exploring today. So mentorship and groups that we bring together, like the Black Agent Connection is a group that we recently launched as well. That's more sort of collaboration, support, peer mentorship, and company mentorship. But the next step of financial investment to be able to help folks get where they want to go from a career perspective, that I haven't really, I'm open to suggestions if anyone has them, but so far we haven't solved that. We've tried a few things that just they sounded really good, but they haven't really worked.
Great. I mean, you're trying, so thank you for that. Awesome.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the question.
And again, Ryan, going back to your leadership, reaching out to the other brands internally within Realty and outside of Realty, that's extremely important because it is not a competition issue. This is our livelihood and it is the future of where we're headed. I'm going to turn this over to Michael Jones, our 2021 president. I know, Michael, you may have a question, but I'm also going to ask Michael to say a few words as well to Ryan and to the audience in general. Michael?
Thank you, John. I'd like to just thank everybody for being here. Kiana, specifically to you, thank you for your continued leadership at Columbus Realtors for NARAB locally. Thank you for the bridge that we continue to walk back and forth from our association to your association and working collaboratively with John, myself, and other members, staff members of Columbus Realtors. Thank you for that. I'd like to thank Dr. Glaude again for this conversation, because even reading the book, it's not the discussion. And the discussion creates thought-provoking ideas. So thank you for giving me some more of those. I actually hear some calls to action for me as a leader of our association, and I will be answering that call to look at the economic exclusion that, quite frankly, is taking place in our current market for other people to participate in the American dream. It's no longer the obvious, no, you can't live here, but it's the kind of cloaked economic obstacle or barrier that we're experiencing right now. So again, thank you for creating some calls to action for me, and hopefully you have for some others. Thank you for all of the people that are here today. It's not just those that have spoken, but it's for those that have taken the time to listen. I believe firmly that healing begins with discussion, conversation, understanding one another. And by you joining this call today, you're taking one of those first steps to do that. So thank you for doing that. Ryan, thank you very much. It's an honor to have you here as well. Obviously, I'm biased because I'm a Coldwell banker agent, but truly appreciate your leadership. You know, you and I will have some continued discussion, I hope, on some opportunities that will create or help remove some of these economic barriers that I'm talking about. You know, I kind of hit on it a few weeks ago when I was speaking with you. So look forward to those opportunities as well, because they're important. We are beginning again what we've gone through before, and we have an opportunity. We have an opportunity to address it. We have mobilization, we have interest, we have synergy, and we want to take advantage of that and move forward. But basically, I want to conclude and say thank you again to everybody. The next book club selection is entitled A Most Beautiful Thing by R. Shea Cooper. It's a true story of a Black high school crew team from Chicago competing against crew teams at Ivy League colleges and universities. The book is one of the literary selections from Stephen Curry's book club and is a phenomenal story of overcoming obstacles. We anticipate hosting a conversation with Mr. Cooper this summer. And again, with that, just thank you to everybody. Have a great afternoon. Thank you for taking the time.
Thanks, everybody. Buzz, thank you.
So much.
And Ryan, thank you. And
Thank
Lynn,
you.
thank you for all your work. Great job.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, John. Thank you, Kiana. Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Have a great day, everybody.